Imagine stepping back in time to the rough, untamed frontier of the Old West. It wasn't just about cowboys and saloons. Survival was a daily gamble, and the odds were rarely in your favor. Disease, violence, and accidents were constant threats, and even the most cautious weren't guaranteed a long life. If you think today's world is tough, wait until you learn how the harsh realities of the Wild West would have likely sealed your fate. In this video, we explore the many ways you could have met your end in one of history's most dangerous eras. A sore loser took his revenge on you after a poker game. Even if you were as skilled with a revolver as the legendary Wild Bill Hickock, the Old West still held its dangers. Even after a high-stakes card game, Hickock became a national icon, not just for his gunfighting abilities, but also due to the exaggerated stories that circulated about his exploits. Over time, Hickock's life took a turn when his eyesight began to deteriorate, which impacted his precision and confidence. In a tragic incident, he mistakenly took the life of a deputy, a mistake that weighed heavily on him. As a result, Hickock made the personal decision to give up carrying sidearms, symbolizing his desire to step away from a life defined by violence. After retiring his holster, Hickock turned to gambling, a popular pastime in the saloons of the Old West. His new venture took him to the mining boom town of Deadwood, located in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It was there that he encountered Jack McCall during a poker game. Hickock's luck was running strong that day, and he managed to win several hands, leaving McCall on the losing end. Despite his victories, Hickock didn't hold any malice. In fact, he offered McCall some money for a meal, a gesture meant to smooth over any resentment. However, McCall harbored deep bitterness over the loss. The following day, fate turned against Hickock in a way he hadn't foreseen. Joining another poker game, Hickock, against his usual practice, took a seat with his back to the door. A risky move in a saloon where threats could come from any direction. McCall reappeared at the same saloon, his feelings from the previous day still lingering. Quietly, McCall approached from behind and put an end to Hickock's storied life. Though Hickock had survived countless dangerous encounters throughout his career, it was this unexpected and personal grudge that ultimately marked the close of his legendary chapter in Old West history. This tragic incident highlights not only the unpredictability of life in the frontier, but also how personal slights and grudges often played a larger role in the fate of individuals than even the fastest draw. You were part of a trigger-happy posse. If you were part of the Earp family standing beside your brother Wyatt, you would have found yourself drawn into one of the most legendary events in Old West history. The Earp brothers, including Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, held positions of authority in Tombstone, Arizona, a bustling frontier town. Their influence made them a key force in maintaining order. However, this also meant conflict was inevitable, especially with the growing tension between them and the Clanton-McClory faction, a group known for cattle rustling and other outlaw activities just outside of town. Tombstone was a town on edge, and the rivalry between the Earps and the Clanton-McClory group grew steadily more heated. The situation was worsened by the unpredictable nature of the frontier, where law enforcement often came into conflict with those who lived outside the boundaries of law. By October 26, 1881, these tensions reached their peak. On that fateful day, both groups found themselves in a vacant lot behind the OK Corral, a location that would go down in history as the setting of a defining moment in the Old West. The details of the confrontation remain debated. While it is unclear who initiated the conflict, within a span of only 30 seconds, the outcome was decisive. 3 members of the Clanton-McClory faction lost their lives, and the remaining few scattered, retreating to safer ground. The quickness of the event reflects the volatility of such showdowns in the Wild West, where disputes could escalate swiftly and dramatically. It cemented the Earp family's place in Western lore, but it also raised questions about law, order, and justice in frontier towns. The OK Corral standoff wasn't just a moment of personal vendetta. It was a reflection of the larger struggles for power and control in a lawless land. You were betrayed by a member. If you led a notorious gang like Jesse James, you would have managed to evade capture through numerous close calls. Despite your reputation for being untouchable, even the most feared outlaws eventually face a moment of vulnerability. By 1881, the railroad companies had had enough of Jesse and Frank James, whose daring robberies caused widespread disruption. Under the direction of Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden, these companies pooled resources to offer a hefty $10,000 bounty for the capture of the infamous brothers. This significant reward was too tempting to resist for Robert Ford, a man who had recently grown close to Jesse. Ford's brother Charlie was also part of Jesse's gang, but the promise of such a large sum, coupled with the potential for a pardon for their own criminal activities, created a strong incentive for betrayal. Despite Jesse's cautious nature and notorious reflexes, he trusted the Ford brothers enough to invite them to live with him and his family in St. Joseph, Missouri. Living under the same roof gave the Ford brothers the advantage they needed. They were well aware of Jesse's reputation for being quick to react, so they waited for the perfect moment, one where Jesse let his guard down. That moment came when he removed his coat and set aside his holster. It was then that Robert Ford took action, marking the end of Jesse James's legendary run. The Ford brothers, who had feared retribution, were soon pardoned for their role in the event. They eventually received the reward money promised by the railroad companies, though their actions forever branded them as traitors in the eyes of many. The story of Jesse James and his downfall is a reminder of how even the most elusive figures in the Old West could be brought down not by lawmen, but by those they trusted most. It also speaks to the broader issue of loyalty and betrayal that was so often a part of life on the frontier. You survived a dangerous life. While Wild Bill Hickock and Jesse James met sudden and untimely ends, you could have forged a legendary life like Kit Carson. Carson, a true frontiersman, embodied the quiet strength and disciplined courage that many young men of his time admired. Unlike the flashier outlaws and gunslingers, Carson's path to fame came through endurance and survival, as he managed to escape fate on numerous occasions. Born in 1809, Carson's life was defined by his resilience and skill in navigating the dangers of the frontier. From skirmishes with rival trappers to enduring the harsh Mojave Desert and surviving brutal blizzards in the Rocky Mountains, he proved time and again that survival on the frontier required both grit and luck. His reputation grew further when he led explorer John C. Fremont on expeditions, including one in 1844 that ended in a confrontation with Native Americans. Fremont later praised Carson's fearlessness, recalling how Carson pursued an unknown group into unfamiliar mountain terrain and engaged them immediately, actions that demonstrated not just boldness, but a deep understanding of the risks and challenges of frontier life. Despite his many successes, the harsh realities of life on the frontier took a toll on Carson. By 1868, his health had deteriorated after decades of rugged living. That same year, Carson welcomed the birth of his seventh child, a moment of joy overshadowed by tragedy when his wife, Josefa, passed away from complications just 2 weeks later. This profound loss seemed to sap Carson's will, and just 1 month later, he passed away when an aneurysm ruptured in his trachea. Carson's life was a testament to the endurance required to survive in the Wild West. His legacy lives on as one of the great figures who navigated the often unforgiving challenges of the West with a steady hand and an indomitable spirit. You sank deeper into alcohol use later in life. The woman known as Calamity Jane remains one of the most iconic figures of the American West, recognized both for her fierce determination and her compassionate nature. She had a strong connection to Wild Bill Hickock, although it appears that her admiration for him wasn't reciprocated in the way she had hoped. After Hickock's death, Calamity Jane made her home in Deadwood, where she faced a series of unfortunate setbacks that would shape the rest of her life. Fame, which had once brought her admiration, became a source of exploitation, with others taking advantage of her reputation. Struggling with these disappointments, she increasingly turned to alcohol, which soon became a problem she couldn't control. In 1903, just before her passing, the Sioux Valley News ran a candid report on her situation, describing how, when intoxicated, she would attempt to revive the wild, lawless spirit of the frontier, behavior that had long since fallen out of favor in a rapidly changing West. The article noted that she frequently ended up in jail, no longer seen as the bold frontier figure, but rather as part of a group the paper referred to as the plain drunks. In her later years, Calamity Jane took up work as a laundress, a humble position far removed from her days of adventure. Her health continued to decline, and she eventually succumbed to pneumonia in 1903, passing away in a small hotel not far from Deadwood. True to her wishes, she was laid to rest beside Wild Bill Hickock, a final testament to her enduring connection to him. Calamity Jane's story reflects the harsh realities faced by many figures of the Old West, who struggled to adapt as the frontier era came to a close. Despite her hardships, she remained a symbol of the rugged independence that defined the West, a figure of both admiration and tragedy in equal measure. You went out with your shoes. Despite their frequent depiction in Western films, dramatic quick-draw duels were an uncommon occurrence in the real Wild West. The classic scene of two men squaring off in the middle of a dusty street, waiting for a signal before drawing their pistols, rarely reflected reality. In fact, these confrontations were usually far less organized and far more chaotic. Most shootouts were fast and clumsy exchanges, often happening as both parties sought cover. Rather than being planned challenges made in the name of honor, many of these incidents stem from alcohol-fueled disputes. Barroom quarrels and general unrest from boredom frequently led to these conflicts, with little of the dramatic buildup one might imagine. Wyatt Earp, one of the West's most renowned lawmen, offered insight into the reality of these confrontations in his autobiography. He noted that winning a gunfight had less to do with speed and more with composure. As he put it, the most important lesson I learned was that the winner usually was the one who took his time. This simple yet profound observation highlights the true nature of gunfights in the Old West, where patience and caution often prevailed over recklessness and haste. This reality underscores how the myth of the quick-draw duel was more Hollywood than history. Life on the frontier was messy and unpredictable, and gunfights reflected that unpredictability. You succumbed to dysentery. Imagine setting out from Independence, Missouri in May 1873 with your family and a wagon full of supplies, heading west along the famous Oregon Trail. The journey was full of promise, but when you reached Fort Laramie, you began to feel a persistent cough. While diseases like dysentery and diphtheria were ever-present dangers in the West, the most feared illness by far was cholera. Sanitation on the frontier was minimal at best, and cholera thrived in the poor conditions. It spread rapidly through contaminated food and water, often catching people off guard. The first sign was usually painless, but sudden diarrhea, followed by rapid dehydration. Without intervention, this often led to kidney failure, which could be fatal. Wagon trains and frontier settlements dreaded cholera outbreaks, knowing that if the disease spread unchecked, it could devastate entire groups, sometimes claiming half their numbers. Though a handful of doctors understood the mechanisms behind cholera, medical help was scarce on the frontier. Those infected were often isolated to prevent further spread. Quarantine was the primary method of control, but it left the sick to care for themselves, often in harsh conditions. Many tragically succumbed to dehydration and organ failure while on the dusty trails, far from the help they needed. The struggle with cholera highlights how life on the Oregon Trail wasn't just a test of endurance against the wilderness, but also a battle against invisible, deadly threats that the frontier's limited medical knowledge and resources could do little to stop. You were Native American. If you were part of the Camp Grant Apache tribe, your community would have already endured years of conflict and hardship at the hands of American forces before reaching a fragile peace with nearby white settlers. However, this peace was fleeting. On April 30th, 1871, tensions boiled over when a group made up of white settlers, Mexicans, and Tohono O'odham, Native Americans launched a sudden attack on the Camp Grant Apaches. The attackers claimed their actions were in response to a series of raids that had occurred in the Tucson area. Tragically, the Camp Grant Apaches had no involvement in these incidents, but that did little to spare them from the violence that ensued. As many as 150 Apaches lost their lives in the massacre, and children were taken captive to be sold into slavery in Mexico. In the aftermath, the attackers were brought to trial, but despite the overwhelming evidence of their involvement, they were acquitted. This injustice highlighted the deep racial and cultural tensions of the time, as Native communities often faced violence without legal protection or recourse. The Camp Grant massacre remains a stark reminder of how fragile peace was on the frontier, with misunderstandings and prejudices leading to devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. You climbed the gallows. Imagine you were an outlaw caught after a failed train robbery and found yourself awaiting judgment in a dusty jail. In the Wild West, hanging was often considered one of the more merciful punishments. The intent was for the drop to be quick, resulting in an immediate and relatively painless death. However, things didn't always go according to plan. A well-known example is the case of Tom Blackjack Ketchum. During his time in prison, Ketchum was fed well, and by the time he faced the gallows, he weighed around 200 pounds. When the trapdoor beneath him finally opened, the force was so extreme that the rope caused his head to separate from his body. This unfortunate mishap was a grim reminder that even executions, intended to be swift, could go horribly wrong. A doctor later reattached Ketchum's head before his burial, attempting to restore some dignity in death. Ketchum's story reveals the crude nature of frontier justice. While hanging was intended to provide a relatively humane end, the lack of precise knowledge and preparation sometimes led to tragic and unintended outcomes. You got kicked in the head by a horse. Many of the legends of the Old West earned their fame from one or two moments of high drama, but for Bill Pickett, facing extraordinary challenges was just part of his daily routine. A renowned rodeo performer, Pickett was considered one of the best in the West, consistently showcasing his incredible skills. Pickett is often credited with perfecting the rodeo technique known as bulldogging, although it's uncertain whether he actually invented it. This daring act involved leaping from the back of a horse onto a wild steer and wrestling it to the ground. It became a signature event in rodeos, and Pickett's mastery of it set him apart as a true cowboy legend. Born in the 1870s, Pickett was unique among Western figures in that he lived long enough to be captured on film, a medium that immortalized few of his contemporaries. He appeared in 2 films, but unfortunately, none of the footage showing him bulldogging has survived. Pickett continued working with horses and livestock well into his later years, but his life came to a tragic end on April 2nd, 1932, when he was accidentally kicked and trampled by a horse he was trying to rope. In 1993, he was honored with a spot in the Legends of the West series of postage stamps, cementing his place in American history. Pickett's story is a reminder that life in the West wasn't just about singular moments of danger. It was about enduring strength, skill, and a lifetime of resilience on the rugged frontier. You suddenly disappeared one day. Perhaps you would have taken after Charles Earl Bowles, better known as Black Bart, one of the most successful outlaws of the Old West. Over the course of his career, Black Bart managed to rob 28 stagecoaches without ever being caught in the act. Despite his criminal endeavors, Bullis earned a reputation as a gentleman bandit, targeting strong boxes while leaving passengers unscathed. Unlike many outlaws, he never resorted to personal theft or unnecessary aggression. Bullis was also known for his poetic flair. On occasion, he would leave behind short verses of poetry at the scene of his robberies, adding a touch of mystery to his already legendary persona. His courteous demeanor and creative antics made him a figure of fascination, setting him apart from the rougher, more violent criminals of the time. Eventually, Black Bart's luck ran out. He was apprehended and sentenced to 4 years in San Quentin. Upon his release, Bullis was asked if he planned to return to his former life of crime. His response was resolute. "No, gentlemen, I'm through." True to his word, Black Bart quietly vacated his hotel room after his release and disappeared without a trace, fading into the vast landscape of the Wild West. His mysterious disappearance only added to the myth, leaving people to wonder whether he truly left his old ways behind or simply embraced a new chapter, vanishing into history's shadows. In the rugged and unpredictable world of the Old West, danger lurked around every corner. Whether it was disease, violent confrontations, or simply the harsh conditions of frontier life, survival was never guaranteed. So if you had lived in those times, how long would you have lasted? One thing's for sure, you would have had quite the story to tell. If you enjoyed this journey into the dangerous life of the Wild West, hit that subscribe button and join us for more fascinating tales of history, mystery, and adventure. Don't miss out on the next wild ride.